In the year of our Lord 1840, London was a city of two parallel worlds. Above, it was the capital of a globe-spanning empire, a place of gaslight, grand exhibitions, and burgeoning industry. Below, in the narrow, fog-choked alleys and courtyards, it was a Dantean hell of poverty, filth, and desperation. It was in this underworld that the smallest and most vulnerable commodities were traded: children. Among them was a boy we shall call Pip, a name he himself did not know, for he had been sold before his memory had formed. He belonged to a master sweep, a man named Bill Jaggers, whose face was as soot-blackened and hardened as the flues he professed to clean. Pip's world was defined by darkness and confinement. He lived in a cellar with 5 other boys, all apprenticed to Jaggers. Their day began long before dawn, when the city was still shrouded in cold smoke and shadow. Their bodies, small and wiry, were their only tools. To make them even more supple and resistant to the abrasive brickwork, Jaggers would often rub their elbows and knees with a brine of strong salt and urine, a process that left the skin raw and weeping, but eventually created a crust of hard, leathery calluses. The economics of the trade were brutally simple. The narrow, twisting flues of Georgian and Victorian townhouses were often only 7 inches square, an impossible passage for any grown man. Only a small child could navigate them. Orphans, paupers from the workhouses, and the children of the desperately poor were sold for a few shillings to masters like Jaggers, who clothed them in rags, fed them a starvation diet of bread and gin, and worked them until they grew too large for the flues, a fate that often came not from growth, but from death. Pip's value was measured in the inches of his shoulders and the pliability of his joints. He was not a child, he was a human brush, a disposable instrument for maintaining the comfort of the world above. The system was self-perpetuating and cruel, a microcosm of the immense social inequality that defined the age. For every grand ball held in a Mayfair mansion, for every cheerful fire lit in a Hampstead hearth, there was a child like Pip, shivering in a cellar, his lungs already filling with the soot that one day would claim his life. A child named Pip is trapped in a living nightmare, his small body a tool for a cruel and profitable trade. His world is one of soot, darkness, and constant pain. But what is the daily reality of his existence? What horrors await him inside the pitch-black, suffocating confines of a London chimney? And who are the other boys who share his fate? And what happens to those who grow too big or defy their master? The first descent into a flue is a moment of pure terror. To follow Pip's harrowing journey into the heart of London's darkness, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a moment of this heartbreaking investigation.
The work of a climbing boy was a daily exercise in terror and torture. Arriving at a grand house in a fashionable square, Pip and the other boys would be led not through the front door, but through the servants' entrance to the basement kitchen. The fireplace would be revealed, a dark, gaping maw smelling of cold ash and damp soot. The mistress of the house would often look away, unable to bear the sight of the tiny, soot-stained child about to be sent into the darkness. The process began with the removal of his ragged clothes. He would work naked, for fabric would snag on the rough brickwork and could trap him. Jaggers would then order him into the opening. To motivate a reluctant child, masters employed brutal methods. Some would light a small, smoky fire of wet straw beneath the grate, the heat and fumes forcing the boy upward. Others, like Jaggers, would use pins, jabbing them into the soles of the child's bare feet, or even lighting tinder attached to their heels. The most common technique was simply to brutalize the child. Pip would feel the sharp, familiar prod of Jagger's climbing stick, a heavy metal pole on his backside, urging him onward. Inside the flue, the world vanished. It was a universe of absolute blackness, so complete it felt solid. The soot was a fine, choking powder that filled his nostrils, his mouth, his lungs. He could not see. He could barely breathe. He moved by bracing his bare back against one wall of the flue and his knees against the other, inching his way upward in a series of painful, jerking motions. Sharp projections of brick and tile would tear at his skin. His elbows and knees were soon a bloody, soot-caked mess. The flues were often hot from recent fires, burning his tender flesh. They twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing to a point where he had to exhale all the air from his lungs to squeeze through, risking becoming stuck, the climbing boy's greatest fear. In the silence of the flue, the only sounds were the scraping of his own body, the frantic beating of his own heart, and the distant, muffled voice of Jaggers shouting up from the fireplace below, "Smartly now, boy! Smartly!" This was not work. It was a form of slow, methodical suffocation, a descent into a personal hell that was repeated dozens of times a day, every day, for years. Trapped in a pitch-black, suffocatingly narrow tunnel of brick and soot, Pip is fighting for every inch of his ascent. The physical agony is unimaginable, but the psychological terror is worse. To be stuck is to face a slow, suffocating death, a fate that befell many climbing boys. But what happens when a child does become trapped? And what other, even more sinister dangers lurk within the labyrinthian flues of a London townhouse? The chimney holds horrors beyond mere confinement. To discover the deadly secrets hidden in the soot and the tragic fates of the boys who never made it out, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
Death was a constant companion for the climbing boy. It waited for him in a dozen different forms within the dark flues. The most common and terrifying end was to become stuck. A boy would wedge himself in a narrow section, unable to move up or down. The master, panicking and fearing discovery, would often try to pull him out by a rope tied to his ankle. If that failed, he might resort to more desperate measures, sometimes even dislodging the child by poking him with the climbing stick, which could lead to fatal internal injuries. More than one sweep was known to simply abandon a stuck child, bricking up the fireplace to hide the evidence of his death, leaving the boy to suffocate slowly in the darkness, his final whimpers silenced by the brick and mortar. Other dangers were equally lethal. The soot itself was a slow poison. Inhaled daily, it led to a horrific and invariably fatal disease the sweeps called sootwort, a cancerous lesion that began in the scrotum, caused by the carcinogen coal tar and spread throughout the body. It was an agonizing death that could take years. Fires were another mortal threat. A household servant, unaware a boy was in the flue, might light a fire to test the draw. The child would be burned alive, his screams echoing up the chimney, unheard by the world below. Then there were the ancient flues, some dating back centuries, that were structurally unsound. A rotten brick could give way, sending the boy plummeting down several stories to be dashed on the hearth below. Or, in the complex, interconnected flues of larger houses, a boy could become lost, navigating a vertical maze until exhaustion or lack of air overcame him. His body might not be discovered for weeks until a strange smell emanating from the fireplace forced its discovery. Pip knew these stories. The older boys, those who had been in the trade for a year or two, whispered them in the cellar at night. They were not ghost stories, they were cautionary tales, a map of the many ways a climbing boy could cease to be. Every time Pip entered a flue, he knew he might not come out. The chimney is not just a workplace, it is a tomb. Pip lives with the daily knowledge that a misstep, a narrow passage, or a simple mistake by a housemaid could mean a horrific and lonely death. But the suffering is not confined to the flues. What is life like for these boys when they are not climbing? Where do they sleep? What do they eat? And what little moments of humanity, if any, pierce the unrelenting darkness of their existence? The cellar where Pip lives with Master Jaggers and the other boys is a world of its own, a small brutal kingdom of soot and sorrow. To step inside the sweep cellar and witness the fragile bonds of survival, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
Life outside the chimney was only a different kind of confinement. The cellar where Pip lived with Jaggers and the other boys was a damp, windowless space beneath a tavern. The air was permanently thick with the smell of soot, unwashed bodies, and the faint, sweet-sour odor of the gin Jaggers used to keep the boys subdued. They slept on piles of filthy straw, huddled together for warmth, their bodies a tapestry of bruises, cuts, and soot-filled sores. Their diet was a calculated form of sustenance designed for their trade. Breakfast was a crust of bread and a cup of gin. The alcohol was not a luxury, it was a tool. It dulled the pain, suppressed the appetite, and made the children more pliable and less fearful. They were given little water, as a full bladder was a liability in a tight flue. At the end of a long day of climbing, they might receive a thin, greasy broth or a potato. Malnutrition kept them small. Constant work and fear kept them in line. Yet even here, in this pit of despair, the embers of humanity glowed. The boys, ranging in age from 5 to 10, formed a desperate, fragile brotherhood. They would pick soot from each other's eyes and clean each other's wounds with their own spit. They shared stories of the houses they'd been in, describing the fleeting glimpse of a painted ceiling or the taste of a stolen sugar cube. Tiny fragments of the beautiful world that existed beyond their own. They had a language of their own, a series of whispers and touches. The oldest boy, a 10-year-old named Tom, who was already beginning to grow too large for the narrower flues, acted as a protector for the younger ones, often taking the blame for their mistakes and absorbing the punishment from Jaggers' stick or belt. This community was their only defense against the absolute annihilation of their spirits. They were the only ones who understood that the whimpers in the dark were not just sounds of pain, but a language of shared suffering. In the darkness of the cellar, a fragile family has been forged in soot and pain. The boys, led by the protective Tom, find small ways to endure the unendurable. But the system that entraps them is vast and powerful. Who profits from this misery beyond the master sweeps? And is there anyone in the glittering world above who sees their suffering and dares to speak against it? A movement is beginning to stir in London, a voice of conscience raised against the agony of the climbing boys. The first rumblings of reform are heard, but they will face fierce and entrenched opposition. To learn about the men and women who fought to end this barbaric practice, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
For decades, the suffering of the climbing boys was an open secret in London, an unpleasant but accepted cost of clean chimneys and comfortable homes. That began to change in the late 18th century, thanks to the relentless efforts of a few grave reformers. The most prominent was Jonas Handway, a philanthropist who, in the 1760s and 70s, published shocking pamphlets detailing the brutal treatment and short life expectancy of the boys. He was met with fierce resistance from the master sweeps and their customers, who argued that the trade was a necessary evil and that the boys, being from the dregs of society, were better off with the trade and a roof over their heads. The battle continued into the 19th century. In 1803, the first piece of legislation was passed. The Act for the Better Regulation of Chimney Sweepers and Their Apprentices sought to limit the age of apprentices to 8 years old and improve their conditions. It was a well-intentioned but utterly useless law. It had no mechanism for enforcement, and the master sweeps simply ignored it. The suffering continued unabated. The most powerful voice, however, was that of a man who had never seen a climbing boy. Charles Dickens, in his novel Oliver Twist, published in serialized form between 1837 and 1839, introduced the world to the character of Oliver Twist himself, a boy who narrowly escapes being apprenticed to the vicious sweep Mr. Gamfield. Dickens' visceral description of Gamfield's cruelty and the horrific fate that awaited Oliver brought the abstract horror of the climbing boys into the parlors of the middle and upper classes. Public opinion began to shift. The image of the small, terrified child being forced into a dark hole became a potent symbol of societal failure. The fight was no longer just about regulation. It was about the soul of the nation. The cries of the climbing boys, amplified by the powerful voices of reformers and writers, are finally beginning to be heard. The public conscience is stirring, but the master sweeps and their allies are a powerful lobby, and they will not give up their cheap, disposable labor without a fight. What will it take to finally break the chains that bind children like Pip to this deadly trade? The final, brutal chapter in the story of the climbing boys is yet to be written, and it will involve one last desperate act of resistance from within the darkness itself. To witness the climax of this struggle and the ultimate fate of Pip and his brothers in Set, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The political battle for reform would drag on for decades more, with several more ineffective acts passed by Parliament. But for Pip, change would not come from Parliament, it would come from a single, catastrophic event. One cold morning, Jaggers took the boys to a large old house in Bloomsbury. The flue was notorious among the sweeps, exceptionally narrow with a sharp, right-angled turn near the top. It was Tom's turn, but Tom, now nearly 11, was too broad in the shoulders. He tried and failed, earning a savage beating from Jaggers for his laziness. Jaggers then turned his furious gaze on Pip. "You're the smallest. Up you go." The flue was colder and damper than usual. Pip began his ascent, the familiar terror gripping him. He inched upward, the rough brick scraping the fresh scabs on his back. He reached the dreaded turn. It was even tighter than he feared. He exhaled, trying to make himself as small as possible, and pushed. He got his head and one shoulder through, but then he stuck. He was wedged fast, his chest compressed, his breathing becoming shallow, panicked gasps. He could hear Jaggers's muffled shouts from below, growing more frantic than the sharp prod of the climbing stick. It was no use. He was trapped. As the panic subsided into a strange, light-headed calm, Pip did something he had never done before in a flue. He looked up. Far above, at the very top of the chimney, he could see a tiny, perfect circle of sky. It was a pale, clean, brilliant blue, a colour he had almost forgotten existed. It was not the soot-stained grey of his world, but a true, untouchable blue. A single white cloud drifted across the opening, He focused on that circle of sky, on that single cloud. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He was no longer in the dark. He was flying free into that impossible blue. His last breath was not of soot, but of a distant, clean wind. His body was recovered hours later, after the homeowners, hearing the master's panicked attempts to free him, summoned the police and had the fireplace dismantled brick by brick. Pip's death, one of hundreds, became a statistic. But it was also a silent accusation. The image of a small boy trapped and staring at a sky he could never reach became the final, unanswerable argument for the campaign that would, in 1875, finally see the passage of the Chimney Sweepers Act that effectively ended the use of climbing boys. The law was enforced, and mechanical brushes replaced the children. The flues fell silent, but the ghosts of the climbing boys, like Pip, remain, a permanent stain of soot and sorrow on the pages of history. The story of the climbing boys is a descent into one of the darkest corners of the Industrial Revolution, a place where the innocence of childhood was sacrificed for comfort and convenience. It is a tale of unimaginable suffering, but also of the fragile bonds of brotherhood and the enduring power of the human spirit, even in the face of absolute darkness. The final silent protest of a child staring at the sky ultimately helped change the world. If you are drawn to the deepest and most dramatic stories of history, to the moments where the human cost of progress is laid bare, then your search for understanding continues with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We are always exploring the darkest corners of history and the human experience.
To understand the persistence of this barbaric practice, one must look beyond individual cruelty to the cold economic calculus that sustained it. The master sweep, often a former climbing boy himself, operated within a tight margin. He paid a pittance to purchase or apprentice a child, and his overhead, the cellar, the minimal food, the gin, was negligible. His income came from the fees charged to homeowners, and his productivity was directly tied to the number and size of the children he owned. A master with a stable of 5 or 6 small, agile boys could service a dozen houses in a morning, a volume of work impossible for an adult using primitive brushes. The child was a depreciating asset. His value decreased with every inch he grew, and his working life was often less than 5 years. The system incentivized acquiring new, younger children constantly and working the current ones to their physical limit, as their prime was heartbreakingly short. This economic engine was lubricated by the willful ignorance of the upper classes. A clean chimney was a matter of safety and comfort. A blocked flue could lead to a deadly house fire or the buildup of poisonous carbon monoxide. The wealthy homeowner, enjoying the warmth of a well-drawn fire, did not wish to be confronted with the horrifying cost of that comfort. It was easier to pay the master sweep his fee and look away as the soot-stained, shivering child was led down to the kitchen. The moral burden was outsourced, the reality of the trade hidden behind the respectable facade of a trade apprenticeship. The entire structure of society, from the parish workhouses that supplied the children to the homeowners who demanded the service, was complicit in maintaining this cycle of abuse. It was not a few evil men, but a system that accepted the destruction of a certain class of children as a necessary, if unfortunate, price of doing business in the modern world. The suffering of the climbing boys was not an accident, but a feature of the economic and social system of the time. It was a profitable enterprise built on the systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable. But how did the children themselves, in their quiet moments, process this reality? Did they dream of escape, of a different life? And what became of the boys who, through luck or resilience, survived their apprenticeship and grew too large for the flues? Their stories, often just as tragic, are a crucial part of this dark chapter. The fate of Tom, Pip's protector, remains to be told. To learn what happens to a climbing boy who outlives his usefulness, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
For Tom, the oldest boy in Jaggers, the writing was on the wall, scrawled in soot and blood. At 10 years old, his shoulders were broadening, and the narrowest flues, the ones that only Pip could navigate, were becoming impossible. Each failure was met with increased violence from Jaggers, who saw his most experienced worker becoming a liability. Tom knew his time was short. The fate of aging climbing boys was a spectrum of misery. A lucky few might be kept on as a journeyman, helping to manage the younger boys and handling the easier, larger flues. But these were the exceptions. Most were cast aside. Some masters, in a final act of exploitation, would simply turn the boy out onto the street, broken in health and spirit, with no trade and no prospects, destined for a life of begging or crime. Others, like the notoriously cruel Jaggers, would sell them off to the next brutal industry, the coal mines, the brick kilns, the factories, where their small stature and condition tolerance for pain and confinement were still of some value. It was merely a transfer from one hell to another. Tom, who had protected the younger boys for so long, now faced his own existential terror. The only life he had ever known was ending, and what lay beyond was a terrifying void. His body was a chronicle of his suffering. A persistent, racking cough shook his frame each morning, a sure sign of the soot asthma that would likely develop into full consumption. The scars on his knees and elbows were deep and permanent. The constant malnutrition had stunted his growth, leaving him with a wiry, underdeveloped body that belied his age. But the deepest scars were on the inside. He had seen too much death, too much fear. He had held smaller boys as they cried themselves to sleep, and he had listened for the telltale silence from a flue that indicated a life had been extinguished. He was an old man in a child's broken body, and his future, if he had one, promised only more hardship and an early grave. The system designed to use him was now preparing to discard him, and there was nothing he could do but wait for the axe to fall. Tom's story illustrates the grim reality that even survival in this trade was a Pyrrhic victory. The boys who did not die in the flues were left physically and psychologically crippled, their lives irrevocably damaged. But as the 19th century wore on, the forces of reform began to gain real traction. Who were the key figures who finally managed to challenge the powerful sweeps lobby? And what specific events and new technologies converged to bring about the eventual end of this practice? The final battle in Parliament and the technological innovation that made the climbing boy obsolete is a fascinating story of progress, however delayed. To understand how this particular hell was finally closed, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The campaign against the use of climbing boys was a marathon, not a sprint, spanning more than a century. Following the initial efforts of Jonas Hanway, the torch was taken up by a succession of determined reformers. In 1834, the Chimney Sweepers Regulations Act was passed, making it illegal to apprentice any child under the age of 14 and requiring sweeps to be licensed. Yet again, enforcement was nearly non-existent. The master sweeps paid lip service to the law while continuing their practices unchanged in the shadows. The turning point came from two directions, simultaneously: technological innovation and a tragic event that shocked the public conscience. The invention of a mechanical sweeping brush, a series of flexible canes and articulated brushes that could be pushed up a flue from below,
provided a viable alternative to the climbing boy. While initially resisted by the sweeps, the technology steadily improved. Then, in 1875, a public inquiry was called following the death of a 12-year-old boy named George Brewster, who was forced to clean the flues at Fulbourn Hospital in Cambridge. He became stuck and suffocated to death. The master sweep, William Wire, was convicted of manslaughter. This event, coming after decades of campaigning, created the perfect storm. Later that same year, the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 was passed. This was the law that finally worked. It required all sweeps to be licensed by the police, and the license could be revoked for using a child as a climber. It gave the police the power to enforce the regulations. Crucially, the technology had advanced enough to make compliance feasible. The age of the climbing boy was, at long last, legally over. It was a victory born of relentless activism, literary exposure, technological progress, and finally, a child's death that the public could no longer ignore. The flues, which had consumed thousands of young lives, fell silent, their small ghosts replaced by the scraping of cane and brush. The legal battle was won, and the technology existed to enforce the ban. But what was the aftermath? How did the master sweeps adapt? And what became of the last generation of climbing boys, the Toms of the world who were suddenly cast adrift? The end of the trade did not mean a happy ending for all its victims. The legacy of soot and sorrow lingered for generations, a permanent scar on the national psyche. The final chapter of this story is one of reflection on the immense cost of progress and the enduring memory of those who paid it. To contemplate the legacy of the climbing boys and their place in our understanding of history, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the final chapter.
The story of the climbing boys does not end with the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875. Its legacy is a complex one. For the last boys, like Tom, emancipation meant being thrust into the world with no education, no family, and a body broken by years of abuse. Many drifted into other dangerous, low-paying trades or became part of the vast army of the Victorian poor. The psychological scars never healed. They carried the darkness of the flu within them for the rest of their days. For society, the climbing boy became a powerful symbol of a bygone era's brutality, a benchmark against which to measure social progress. The campaign to save them was a foundational moment in the development of modern child labor laws and a testament to the power of sustained social activism. Writers like Charles Dickens had shown that literature could be a force for social change, could give a voice to the voiceless. The image of the small, soot-blackened child shivering in the cold became an indelible part of the Victorian cultural landscape, a haunting reminder of the human cost of the Industrial Revolution. Today, the memory of the climbing boys is kept alive in museums and history books. When we see a vintage illustration of a sweep or a character in a period drama, we are witnessing an echo of this terrible history. The chimneys of old London still stand, but they are now silent, their dark passages empty. Yet, if one listens closely, perhaps one can still hear the faint, ghostly echo of a small boy's scraping ascent, a whisper from the past, urging us never to forget that progress, too often, is built on the backs of the smallest and most vulnerable. The story of Pip and Tom is not just a historical curiosity. It is a permanent cautionary tale about the price of comfort and the enduring need for compassion and justice in an often cruel world.
The story of the Climbing Boys is a journey into the heart of the Industrial Revolution, a place where the innocence of childhood was sacrificed for comfort and convenience. It is a tale of unimaginable suffering, but also of the fragile bonds of brotherhood and the enduring power of the human spirit, even in the face of absolute darkness. The final, silent protest of a child staring at the sky ultimately helped change the world. If you are drawn to the deepest and most traumatic stories of history, to the moments where the human cost of progress is laid bare, then your search for understanding continues with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We are always exploring the darkest corners of history and the human experience.